Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And then I welcome back. I'm very happy seeing your face again in our webinar. So this is the second day of our webinar, ADBI Policy Makers E-Training, Sustainable Green Finance. So before we start, again, I would like to remind you all about the housekeeping rules. So please mute your microphone when you're not presenting or talking. Leave your question in Q&A box or raise your hand if you want to have a question. So before we start, I think my colleague Alex will take a screenshot of all of us. Please switch on your video. So yeah, we take a photo session now.
Hello, everybody. Could all the speakers please turn on your video? And we'll be taking a photo in just 5 seconds. Okay, and one more. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Now we start our webinar today with the book launch of Intersecting. The book is issued by Global Solution Initiative in collaboration with ADBI, GIZ, and OECD. Yeah, as you know, I'm Nella Henriette. I'm Senior Capacity Building and Training Economies at ADBI, and today I will be your moderator in this book launching session. We have our 4 panelists in here in this session. They are editors and contributors of the book. So we will have like interactive discussion in this session. So as you know, my team already sent you the link of the book, so you may already have some insight what is in the book. So you can ask questions, and we will have a discussion, and just raise your hand and put your question in Q&A box, and yeah, we will to ask the panelists. So before we start discussion, I will introduce our first our 4 panelists. I would like to introduce Mr. Holger Kuge. He's a policy advisor on strategic knowledge partnership, GIZ. He is one of the editor of the book. Hi, Holger. Alex, can you? Yeah. And then our second panelist will be Mr. Nicolas Bouchot. He's a Global Solution Fellow, the president of the Grand Paris Alliance for Sustainable Investment in Paris. So hello, Nicolas.
Bonjour.
So our third panelist will be our dean, Professor Tetsushi Sonobe. I have introduced him to you all yesterday. And then our fourth panelist will be Miss Aziza Ahmoj. She is the head of Division of Cities, Urban Policy and Sustainable Development, OECD. So Aziza and Din Sonobe are contributors to the book, and then from the knowledge partners side. So thank you for all of us today. And then before we start our discussion, I would like to ask my first question to maybe first to Holger and Nicolas as co-editors of the book. Holger, first, could you share with us what is the background of this book, and what were your expectations with publishing Intersecting, and what are the feedback? So maybe I give the floor to Holger first, and then Nicolas. So 3 minutes each. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniela. Hello, good day to everybody. Yes, the background was.
You still mute. Could you unmute?
I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Hello. Good day to all. Hello, dear Daniela. The background actually was a very simple, to dramatic one, if you like. It was the extraordinary circumstances that caught up with us with the pandemic last year. So here the GSI Global Solution Initiative supported with all of us, ADBI, OECD, and GIZ. We organized a dialogue in the second half of 2020. This dialogue was called Urbanization Responses to COVID. And the tenor of those dialogues was that the pandemic isn't just make us aware of the problems we already knew about before the pandemic. For example, inadequate infrastructure, be it gray, green, hard or soft infrastructure, social and spatial inequalities that ultimately threaten everyone. The tenor was mainly that the way we analyze and then try to solve challenges is mostly done in silos and is therefore inappropriate. And that is exactly where intersecting comes in. A kind of photograph, we wanted to do a sort of photograph of our urban realities and the requirements for solutions. And to do this, actually, we gathered a bunch of experts. And what our goal was from the very beginning, to show and to build interdependencies between sectors, for instance, health and food, between political departments, for instance, mobility and housing, between communities, the rich gated neighborhoods and people from slums, and between geographies, the global north and the global south, as well as the local and multilateral level. That was the idea, to capture that photograph, how people think. From the perspective of our work as GIZ, with many technical cooperation, also in the region where ADB is active, a region with manifold realities, this dialogue was an opportunity really to listen to important voices from different countries, to understand the analytical and conceptual responses to the situation. Finally, the usefulness of our work depends always on iterative exchanges and adaptations. That's why that's also important to capture this momentum.
Nicholas, I think now Nicholas Chen.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Nela, can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Can you continue?
Yes, sure. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Usually, we have our Japanese friends being very late, right? Because we are having webinars in the beginning of our afternoon. So this is our turn to be at very early in the morning. But it's really a pleasure to be here with you together and share this launch of intersecting with ADBI. And acknowledging the role that both Din Sonobe and Nela and several members of ADBI played in supporting and contributing to intersecting. As my colleague and friend Holger has mentioned, the book was not designed initially as a book. It was not meant to be an editorial project. However, as we were convening at a moment of very high level of uncertainty linked with the crisis, right? We all should remember how was the situation in spring 2020. We were all discovering this virus. There was no stabilized information about that. And we had an understanding that the consequences on our social systems, on our society, and on cities, starting with the lockdowns, of course, and the disruptions in supply chains and people facing the unknown, were raising many questions. And among those questions, there was the idea of very simple questions. What about the future of urban life, right? Given this pandemic, we started to realize that a virus could put down somehow the whole economy. And another assessment sort of was that despite the abundance of think tanks, right, and organizations, especially within the G20, supposedly analyzing economic issues, risks, etc., we were mostly all very unprepared, right? And we were caught very much by surprise. Therefore, we felt also that it was very important that in this conversation, there would be institutions, Holger has mentioned the Global Solutions Initiative, think tanks like ADBI, etc., acknowledging and recognizing that we were not very much prepared for this crisis. And this also raises questions about two things. First, our ability to cope with a crisis that we were not prepared to meet. And another issue is how then can we understand these changing conditions around us, and how organizations, institutes, experts, which are supposed to be advising and delivering solid advice, right, regarding macroeconomic development, sustainable development, etc., could still be very legitimate in doing this in a context where finally quasi everyone, from governments to the private sector to think tanks, academia, etc., were on the same starting line, right? So somehow the dialogues which incubated Intersecting initially as a book was a common recognition of our weaknesses, but also a common understanding that by talking together and by tackling the very issues of the crisis meant we needed all to go much beyond our typical spheres of expertise and understanding, also maybe to shape new tools or new ways to look at the situation. My last comment, Nela, would be that when we started to scratch a little bit beneath the surface, there were two things. First, we realized that three things. First, we realized that over the past 10 years, worldwide, be it in Paris, in Tokyo, or in many cities, especially in developed countries, right, there has been a kind of competition for who is the most innovative, right? And that has not really helped in addressing the crisis. A second is that the management or the responses at a macroeconomic level to the crisis, the global financial crisis of 2008 by the G20 has been efficient in securing the banking system, has been far less efficient in addressing the need to support social capital and social infrastructure, education, hospitals, etc. This cannot all be resolved by innovation. And third, that there were alerts about the risks of a pandemic such as the COVID-19, including in the G20. I'm thinking here about the work of the G20 Germany, that was in 2017, or the work during the G20 Japan in 2019, but practically none of the results of the explorations about health and potential risks were really taken very seriously. And that's also a question not just for the experts, but also for governments about how seriously we are preparing ourselves to meet important crises.
Thank you, Nicholas and Holger. I mean, for very impressive explanation in the course of the book. So now we're going to our two panelists, that Dean Sonobe and Aziza. So like I mentioned before, that they from the knowledge partners. So it's knowledge partners contribution in the book. So why do you choose to engage and contribute to Intersecting book? So what value and outcome did you expect from the book? I think I give the floor first to Dean Sonobe, and then after that, Aziza.
Okay, thank you, Nela. Yeah, in my view, governments in most countries in the world today are better or much better than themselves 50 years ago in terms of the level of human capital of government officials. Especially in developing countries, the progress has been huge, because many of government officials today have received or are receiving very good education and training, just like this. And then thus governments have much better problem-solving abilities today. In addition, those institutions that help the government make and implement policies are also better than before. So these institutions include civil organizations, watching the governance and the think tanks that propose policies and provide information useful for policy making. So, but nonetheless, the world has faced huge problems like the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, and many more may come in the future. This is because we are living in the globalized world, where the problems come from other countries as well as home country. And also, in order to solve those problems, countries have to cooperate and collaborate. This type of policy problems was a kind of weak spot for the governments. In addition, the global problems tend to have strong impacts on the variety of aspects of our lives, which cannot be addressed from any particular specialized discipline of science or perspectives. This type of policy problems was a weak spot for many think tanks and civil organizations. Multidisciplinary issues were weak spot for those think tankers who focused on particular discipline based on the old-fashioned image of think tank as a tank of knowledge, so rather than network. So these weaknesses were already rightly pointed out by Nicola Olga. So intersecting, so this project, as already mentioned, explained by Nicola and Olga, is really a great idea. But if intersecting was easy, it would have taken place earlier. So the reason why it was non-existent before is that its intersecting is difficult. But I thought the main editors, Nicola, Olga, and Gunnar, would be able to put the idea into a shape. I joined them just because I believed in the quality and the width of their networks and their capabilities to put many elements together. So, and I'm not sure that my trust has been rewarded by the output. Please look at this beautiful book. And I'm sure that many people in the world, especially young people, will be more willing to participate in this kind of efforts to promote cooperation and coordination beyond the border of discipline, as well as national borders, to address increasingly global, interconnected, complicated policy problems in the future. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Rinsonobe. Now I think I give the floor to Aziza, Ms. Aziza Ahmed. Please.
Thank you very much, Nelly, and thank you all for the invitation. I'm really delighted to see this big day. It's been a lot of work to shape this report, and it's really nice to go the extra mile in the dissemination. I think for us at the OECD, there were actually three main reasons for joining that initiative. The first one is that it's part of our daily job to actually write reports. We write 700 books a year on a range of public policies, and we are firm believers that when you are actually putting the data and the evidence on the paper, this becomes actually a basis to guide public action and decision making. So anything that can take us from a policy dialogue, closed door meetings, or even public meetings where we share good practices, headaches, and give tips to each other, to a more one-stop shop publication or output or whatever that crystallizes somehow the wisdom and provides the guidance to make reforms happen is very much in the core of our DNA. So it was really a pleasure to join that collective undertaking, building on work we were doing in those days to try to understand how different cities were responding to the pandemics and what were not only the short but also the long-term implications to rebuild the cities of the future. So it was a very good way to, let's say, build on the mission of the OECD, which is to advise governments on how to develop better policies for better lives and to contribute to that robust evidence. The second reason, which is always very challenging when we are working with plenty of constituencies and especially local leaders, was that the book was somehow, at least for me and the chapter on the lessons from COVID-19, a good opportunity to, let's say, structure a bit the thinking around what are some of the major paradigm shifts that we're seeing come for cities tomorrow. And we proposed those 10 lessons, 10 takeaways from the pandemic that were, you know, also aiming to dispel some of the myth we were hearing, you know, people quitting large metropolitan areas to settle down in rural areas in the teleworking revolution. We see this is not happening because people, of course, are not concentrating in large cities only for agglomeration benefits and works. They're also there because they believe they have a better quality of life. Plenty of you know, stories around centralization, decentralization. Actually, cities are not in charge of health. Yes, it's true. Most of the public spending and investment that goes to health is actually discharged by national governments or regional governments, but cities are actually driving the economic, social, and environmental determinants of health that are equally important down the road. Issues related to the potential of mid-sized cities that we're not talking too much about, but that in this new period, you know, have strong potential and a big card to play for a more balanced urbanization. So there were a number of things we were collecting from what mayors were doing and the kinds of public debates that were going on. And I think this was one of the first pieces actually where we have crystallized a bit that thinking. And I found this was extremely analytically challenging, but also very stimulating. And then the last point for us was really the audience. I think as OECD, we work a lot with governments. I mean, our daily job is really to build consensus, to shape recommendations, to target governments, the wires of public administration, but we're also insisting very much that governance is not only about governments, and we need to find channels that can, you know, also display the evidence, the data, the information to a much broader set of constituencies, which is something maybe we manage sometimes to do with an OECD report, but something that sometimes requires another type of format and output. And I found this was a beautiful journey, this intersecting, you know, to put different peoples around the table, different disciplines, but also different constituencies that ultimately probably have that shared responsibility to build forward better. So, I mean, from the top of my head, I would say this is it.
Thank you, Aziza. Thank you, Dinsonobu. Yes, I mean, like the book is so simple. I mean, the language and it's easy to understand. So this will reach the audience like in more than government. So we agree about that. And then I think that's also how ADBI also, I mean, try to you know, spread the ideas, what happened in the international to you know, Asia Pacific community. So now we go to our, I would like to ask, I mean, what your idea when you write in this, some of the book, a chapter on the book. So I think I will go to Aziza first. You know, in your chapter, I found out that you have 2 chapters here. So you mentioned about how the COVID-19 crisis and the responses to it underline the importance and potential of long-term strategies for cities to be more inclusive, greener, and smarter in their recovery efforts. And the underlying governance and financing need to be to enable transformation. Could you elaborate about that a little bit? Could you elaborate more about these long-term strategies for city, and then how, like you mentioned, how a city or government can establish such strategy?
Sure, happy to. So there are a few things. The first one is that we were very surprised to see that although in the first, let's say, 3 to 6 months of the pandemic, most mayors and local leaders were actually focusing on very short-term pressing issues that consisted not only in implementing nationwide initiatives related to lockdown and distancing, but also supporting business recovery, targeting vulnerable groups, making sure there would be some continuity of local public services, securing a bit their citizens, raising the awareness, communicating, and so on. And then pretty quickly, I have to say, even before national governments started shaping their recovery packages and with the EU support for EU countries, we saw really quite a big transition and quite a quick transition to this build back better narrative, and this idea that all pandemics in the past have triggered rethinking about urban paradigm at large, and it's not the first time. I mean, if you take the cholera, 19th century and Paris and huge infrastructure investments, I mean, this has really contributed to improve the life of urban dwellers. Very quickly, there was this jump into, okay, what is it that we're learning from this crisis that will make sure we are, integrating in the way we plan, we design, we finance, we manage our cities in the future. And all the cities we've been working with have been basically structuring such thinking around the green, the smart, and the inclusive, how we make the most of the technology, how we reorganize public space when people are asking for more amenities, and how we fight inequality that has become the hottest potato of governments at local level today. And we saw basically 3 big paradigm shifts. We saw that most local governments have actually embraced the digital and teleworking revolution, even if this comes at a cost, and are now rethinking, and trying to respond to basic questions such as, what are we going to do with all these offices where people are not going to work every day? I mean, what is the future of business districts? How are we reviving city centers? How are we shifting towards more multifunctional infrastructure, etc.? There was a second stream, which is really about this accessibility discourse. You've all heard the 10-minute city in Brussels, the 15-minute city in Paris, the 20-minute city in Melbourne, and this idea that we need to shift from these logics of mobility, whereby we take people from point A to point B, to a city that actually builds around services and accessibility. But there is a big questioning there around the spatial segregation that this may generate if those cities are not properly connected to their rural areas. So this accessibility discourse is gaining a lot of traction. And then a last point on the environmental awareness, which I think in many OECD countries at least provides a window that makes a number of solutions way more acceptable socially and politically today than they were just a year ago. I mean, if you remember just the cycling path and the bronca they generated in many countries, and the reduction of the car dependency, and all this transition, accelerated transition towards a circular economy, nature positive cities, etc. So those are like really the 3 areas that that we've seen with, and I finish with that, a very strong potential for mid-sized cities, especially those that are located close to large metropolitan areas, because they can continue to borrow agglomeration benefits while reducing some of the costs, and also because they're less of a source of inequality. We know that the bigger the city, the bigger the inequality. So, and that's my final word, we've been really vocal that there is a need for robust national urban policy. National governments have actually a huge role to play to make sure they get their cities right. It's not something that should be left only to the local level. And this national urban policy is what can enable this polycentric quality urbanization that we need for tomorrow.
Interesting. Thank you, Aziza. Oh yeah, for everyone, if you want to ask questions, please raise your hand. And then, among the panelists, and you can always also, raise your hand and ask question. So I think now I will give the I will ask Jinsonobe first. In your chapter 2021, Building Forward Better in Developing Economies, you mentioned that in the benefit of agglomeration effect of large cities. But large cities in developing economies are excessively congested, chaotic, extremely inconvenient, and very different from those in developed countries. So for that, government should put priorities to satellite city development to help reduce congestion and inconvenience in large cities. So learn from this COVID-19 pandemic, what do you think city government should do for the city development in Sonobe?
Okay. Thank you, Nera, for my favorite question. Actually, I wonder if I can make my long story short when it comes to my favorite topic. So agglomeration economies is a major driver of economic prosperity. It is an economics jargon or technical term, meaning the benefits of geographical concentration of economic activities in relatively narrow area, such as industrial districts or clusters, cities, large cities, or metropolises. Benefits emerge because in such places, sellers can easily find buyers, and buyers can easily find sellers, and then the entrepreneurs can find engineers, managers, other experts, and skilled workers who are willing to work with them. Once a city grows in size of population, many people come to the city to do business and to earn profits, work to earn labor incomes, and consume a richer variety of goods and services. So agglomeration economies is almost always associated with agglomeration diseconomies. This is a problem. So agglomeration diseconomies means all the costs and problems due to congestion, which becomes a major source of income inequality as well, as I will explain. Because of congestion, land rents and the land price go up, making landlords richer. Although tenants and renters suffer from increased rents, but still many people continue to come from the outside of the city, being attracted by wealth created by agglomeration economies. So there are three types. One type is rich people who do not care high rents, who are able to occupy the best places in the city. The second type is ordinary people who cannot pay high rents and instead living outside of the city center, taking longer time to commute to workplace in business districts in central part. The third type is poorer people with no money for rents who will squat in park, narrow strip of land along railways, rivers, and they make a slum. So these second and the third types of people come even before the city government makes a good city planning. So the so-called urban sprawl takes place. So in many cases, the city government stops planning and restart planning when they find the city population is growing faster than they expected. So they, forget about the previous plan and then try to make new plan. So in this way, the city government response tend to be delayed. So in the meantime, those who live in the remote parts of the sprawled city suffer from the lack of proper city planning, access to artery roads, access to storage system, and even access to drinkable water. So those in slums are even more miserable. They are expelled from the city and taken to the remote edge of the sprawled city, where no jobs they can find. So many of them come back to the city center and then expelled again to even more distant places. So this is the reason why many large cities in developing countries are chaotic, ugly, and unproductive. And then this is why I argue that satellite cities building is needed. satellite cities are located not too distant place from the existing large city center, because agglomeration economies in the large city are still important for prosperity. But satellite cities can mitigate the congestion in large cities. And also they can be equipped with all the necessary infrastructure, including storage system, the water supply, and also social infrastructure, like schools, hospitals, and good education. And today, so digital infrastructure must be the part of such necessary infrastructure. So the satellite city building will help the mitigating the inequality and developing the inclusive society. And also this can be a kind of preparation for future pandemic. For example, the supply of the clean water will be very, very important for preventing the COVID-19 infection. So, yeah, the city government officials, yeah, will be prepared for these things. But once that they have to create a new city, they have to have a variety of issues. So their planning includes a lot of things. So not only those basic infrastructures, but also you have the city government officials have to think about how to create industries in the satellite city. And then if they can create the industries, they have to invite the companies, and then companies will need those workers who have proper skills. So the city government office have to provide vocational training and those things together. And then if the many people live there, then hospitals and schools, all those things are needed. So this ministry has to cooperate with another ministry of. So that kind of coordination will be very, very difficult. And then, yeah, it's a good opportunity for you the government officials to participate in the training program like this ADBI's E-Training. Yeah. So it's a good opportunity for networking to, not only with the people, government officials from other countries, but maybe the government official from the same country, but belonging to different ministries. So that kind of network will become a very important asset in the future. So the variety of, different types of interdisciplinary knowledge about the policy issues, and then the skills of making the plan into a kind of shape. So yeah, a lot of things for the government officials, especially the city government officials, to learn. So I think the capacity building and training activities, become even more important in the future. Thank you, Nera.
Thank you, Dinsonobe. Very comprehensive and yeah, inspiring. Coordination, the hard part. Okay. Now I think we go to Holger. Holger, you in your chapter about the pre-pandemic signs of changing urban health landscape, you mentioned about how there is a change in urban health landscape even before the pandemic. You mentioned about the change of hospitals landscape in China, Singapore, and Hong Kong, learn from SARS, and US and UK learn from Ebola. So how people and policies react to address that. So in Western countries, the health policy more focused on the virus rather than pandemic itself, and vice versa. So the situation also affects how countries develop their health facilities, tackle the issues of pandemic and health crisis. So, and you mentioned at the end, this is intersecting pioneering. So could you elaborate how that, about that, and how do you think this intersecting book can influence or attract attention to this issue? Yeah, if you can be sharp.
Thanks, Nella. It's a huge and complex question. Let me start very, let's say, simple. Coming from the International Development Corporation, there's something new, to be honest. Just last week, we got a sort of confirmation that we have to work now much more in an urban, let's say, international audience about the, let's say, local health risk management in cities. So that's, for instance, something, to be honest, we didn't pay much attention last year or before the pandemic. So this is now something the ministry asked us to cooperate and to organize an exchange among cities from Latin America, Asia, Africa, Europe, and so on, to define measures to exchange good experiences and to ask even what are institutional, let's say, preconditions we need to have this sort of local health risk management. In general, I would say what I see now, the pandemic accelerates in the more affluent countries all the technological upheavals that existed already before. For instance, the new genetic vaccination technology, digital medicine, and a very, let's say, technological reorganization of hospitals. That's something, let's say, I see it slowly, but I guess this will happen in any case in the more affluent countries. In emerging countries, I would say the division of healthcare between state-of-the-art technologies and at the other side, underserved basic care. I guess this sort of economy is becoming more pronounced, unfortunately. And last but not least, in developing countries, I think the further development of health facilities is accelerated overall and will get a huge boost. In, let's say, as far as Western countries are concerned, Germany, France, European Union, I think it's still too early to say. The current measures are acute interventions to stabilize, just to stabilize infrastructures, but structural reforms are not yet, let's say, in place. At the moment, it seems to me that the focus of attention is still very much on the virus, rather than on the pandemic and the public health problems that have become apparent. That's something I observe, let's say, in our part of the world. The intersecting wants to actually to value the benefits from various experiences on healthcare, etc. This is a big issue, but not an easy one, and for some also a very provocative one. It is easier when it comes to questions of hard infrastructure. For instance, hospitals. It becomes more difficult when it comes to institutions. For instance, health insurance is compulsory versus private choice. Or services, public services versus private health services. At the same time, it touches on paths of science and therapies. There is, for instance, a very long and old traditions in Asia, the famous Chinese medicine or Ayurveda medicine. And there is a Western conventional medicine. And there we are in the realm of cultural and social dimensions. What happened before the pandemic is a sort of confluence, I would say, especially in big cities, in larger cities. It's a sort of confluence of all this, all the different types of medicine. Especially in places what I described in that article in London, but also in the US, service that especially the middle classes, the affluent middle classes search for. What I mean by intersecting pioneering are initiatives such as the one I described in the article of a German, let's say, Germany-based society called Steinbeis, are this kind of initiatives which do not operate in a sort of binary either or. They are initiatives that value and apply useful approaches, for instance, healthcare and healing from all cultures, and take the benefit of all that together. And then now I want just to underline an experience we came across in Europe, a very simple but imminent example. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was so difficult for the European public to acknowledge the usefulness of masks Yes, to cover your mouth and nose in public spaces and means of transport. However, such practice, which existed in Asian countries even before the pandemic, has proven to be very valuable. And now this has been implemented in Europe as well by governments, by the way, and society, our societies have slowly adapted to that. The situation is different with traditional medical therapies from Asia, which are increasingly visited in the middle class of Western countries, I said. Here it's a society, actually, the middle class society, who more and more came to a point and looking and using this sort of offer in our big cities. So it's a sort of very interesting landscape. Then, of course, even let's say the dimension of communities in cities, places, you know, in some poorer areas of our cities, there are special services. So that's a very, let's say, interesting moving landscape we can observe.
Thank you, Holger. Yes, I remember when I came to Japan, people already get used with masks. Now all over the world, people have to wear masks.
You know, because if you think in Paris, you know, I lived for a couple of years in France. There are so many Japanese tourists, and the ordinary, let's say, average French or Parisian person would say, "What are they doing?" But now they know what they do and for what purpose.
Yeah. So that's a good example. So now I think we go to Nicholas. You know, I take some point from your article about unlocking the COVID-19 from cities. So you mentioned it's not all about inequities and injustice. It is also a lot about human capital and people plans for the future. Therefore, well-managed large-scale urban development and urban regeneration projects are needed to be catalysts of integration. So you mentioned about inclusive urbanization as well. So what is it actually, that term, and what factors that you think will be the most influence to reach the inclusiveness of the benefit of urbanization? Nicholas, please.
Thank you. This is a very significant question. So addressing it in 2 minutes, it's quite a challenge. But I would like to insist on a couple of things. Aziza rightly mentioned that at the beginning of the pandemic, there has been so many, you know, ideas that the cities will be about that, the impact of the virus will be this and this and this and that. So a lot of ideas are floated around and circulated. A lot of them proved to be very wrong, right? Besides that, my point here and our point in the book is that the pandemic has really highlighted the unbalanced form of urbanization in many cases. For instance, and the absence of regulations about issues which look local, but in fact, which are global. I'm taking the example of real estate, for example, and what Dean Sonobe mentioned about real estate values. There is absolutely no regulation globally, right, about the impact of real estate markets on agglomeration economies, on urban structure, etc. So what we see is a competition. What we saw is a competition for high rise or higher rise or even higher rise, right? In some cases in planned economy, centrally planned economy, in some cases in completely free market environments. But every time it is about plans and regulations and how to include citizens or how this could be fitted with more comprehensive public transportation planning, etc. This is considered by national governments or by multilateral institutions to be under the responsibility just of local governments, which in a part is very important and true, but which is in part is not true. So one way to deal with that, and this was also mentioned by Aziza and Dean Sonobe, is to channel global finance more at subnational level, but that's not sufficient. right? The belief that only public entities are running cities, right, is completely a misunderstanding. Private forces, large companies, MSMEs are also playing a great role, but also industries. In Europe, for example, we have tended to completely forget that because we are in highly tertiary societies and everything is about startups and services, that industry, supply chains are playing such a critical role, which in Asia is not possible to forget because you can see it just outside the window. But how is this managed? In the Global Solutions, we have also this, the Global Solutions Initiative, we have also this conversation, right? Quite discussions, not to say disagreements, about whether there would be the macroeconomics for the big things on the one hand and the local level for the sort of daily kitchen on the other hand. This is, I don't believe this is true, right? And as long there is not an understanding that for some factors, such as climate finance, for example, or biodiversity, or another range of factors, which should include also factors such as real estate finance, as long as they are not managed more efficiently globally, and that raises many questions, right? About the level of independence of, for example, subnational governments. I'm not saying it is simple, but this should be addressed, and it cannot be just led to sort of local adjustments. I think here this could be highly controversial, but on the other hand, the question of the level of accountability and the level of management of issues, what is left in the hands of the people, what is left in the hand of the citizens, right, to control their own future, and not just to take part to nice projects, but also to really have a say in their future, is something that somehow, not the virus, but as my colleague Holger has said, the pandemic as a health and social and socio-economic issue, has put on quite highly. And at this moment, this was my last Montanella here, at this moment, what we can see is that most national governments, they are issuing plans and they are discussing together in the G7 or in the G20, and that's very fine. We can see also that city networks, they are extremely active, and they have been extremely active, and OECD has taken a great part in that in the past months. But we can see also a kind of disconnection in many cases between people, citizens, and the institutions, which is really preoccupying. And this happens a lot in cities. And the way that future urban policies can serve as a bridge to reconcile these different bits and pieces is something of utmost importance. We have tried also not to forget, while talking about cities and infrastructure, about this aspect through intersecting. But again, it's not very easy, and it will require a lot more work and expertise. I think in the last minutes we will be able to say about what will be the next steps of the process.
Thank you, Nicholas. I think we have a question raised hand from Paradika Gali. Here, could you give you deliver your question, and then maybe who's the panelist that you direct to?
Thank you, Ms. Nela. My question is for Mr. Sonobe. You explained that one of the options to reduce the various problem of big cities is to develop a satellite city. But how can we develop these satellite cities so it doesn't follow the same pattern of its main cities? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Christine. You still mute? Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much for a good question. Yeah, so let me a little bit talk about Japanese experience. I was born in 1960, the year when the Japanese government started the very famous income doubling plan, when Japan was kind of one of the emerging economies. And then the existing large cities are all extremely crowded. And then what the government did was So make a small city between the existing big cities. And then between the small city and big city, another. And then between small and small new cities, another one. And then finally, those cities kind of became like a belt. So that's called the Pacific industrial belt. Not necessarily industrial, but I forgot to say this before, but I want to add one thing. So satellite city can be a hub for the marketing of the agricultural products. So it will also help the farmers. And maybe I expect that I will have no more time to add. So I want to say about the importance of intersecting once again. So I think intersecting is particularly important for the issue of green finance, which is the theme of this e-training course. And because now, many things are so closely related to infrastructure if we expand the concept of infrastructure to cover the social infrastructure as well. And then to construct good infrastructure, we need money. So the finance. So finance, is related to almost every progress, every aspect of progress of society in the world. And then also we have to connect everything to green. So everything must be green. So everything is related to finance, and then those things are all related to making the world greener. So intersecting is, I think, the most important approach to policy issue, problem solving. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dean Sonobe. I think I hope that can answer your question, Mr. Paradika. Actually, in my thinking, also like the satellite cities, kind of like how we build that connectivity. Connectivity always like improve the multiplier effect of the economy. So there's one big city, we build the city, and there's the economy will connect to source of growth, and that will increase the growth. So I'm not supposed to talk more. So we run out of time. My colleagues already remind me, but I think we need to have like what's the next step for our for the intersecting book. So I think I start from Holger and Nicholas first, and then Dean Sonobe and Aziza later. What do you expect? I mean, what will be the next step for intersecting book? So if you can, like each of you, answer in 1 minute. Thank you. Holger.
There will be sort of intersecting number 2. I guess Nicola wants to say also something what happens now with the already existing intersecting, but I already announced there will be an intersecting number 2 in addition about circular economy with 3 major intentions: to give evidence first where to target, where to start in the production chain to close the loop, what we want to reach with the circular economy, and avoid waste, because that's a dominating topic in all of our cities, how to manage, how to get rid of our waste. And then the other question is which levers in supporting policies could be systematically operated, and how to move from various pilot projects. We have plenty of pilot projects, but we are not strong and not prepared to get a broad application breakthrough. So, and we want to publish and prepare, first of all, a new intersecting about those 3 questions.
Thank you.
So Nela, yeah. So that's for 2022, 2023, right, Holger?
Exactly. But we need input and inspiration from all of you.
So that's one point. And as Holger was pointing out, we are currently very busy preparing an updated edition of Intersecting that was issued in March. This was planned initially because we knew that when we would be publishing the first edition, then some of the findings will have to be updated because the situation is changing. So in October 2021, for the summit of the T20, we will be, the Think Tank 20, we will be editing an updated, upgraded version with about a dozen new additional contributions. I'm also very happy to announce that University of Indonesia, the Institute for Social and Economic Research of University of Indonesia, LPEM UI, will be a knowledge partner, and that her director, Riyatu Mariatu, has also agreed very willingly to join us as a co-editor. And we have been having since March a number of online discussion seminars, including with LPEM. We will have 2-day seminar in India with Indian colleagues from RIS and OP Jindal Global University to deepen the notion of intersecting. So we are constantly upgrading that. So stay tuned. And if you are interested, you can go through ADBI. Of course, this is an open platform. This is not a closed club. And let me just say that this second edition will be edited in a digital format, right, with updates. And we decided it's a big work, I can tell you, but we will also edit it in a paper version so that there is an object that can also circulate.
Thank you, Nicholas. I think, yeah, from the knowledge partner perspective, Dean Sonobe and Aziza, I think Dean Sonobe first, what do you expect for the next?
Yes, so intersecting kind of project needs a great coordinator and a leader. So I just expect Nicola and Olga continue to play the key roles. And yeah, so on my side, to keep ourselves ready to participate, cooperate anytime.
Thank you, Dean Sonobe. Aziza.
So 3 quick points from my end. The first one is we're happy to continue to join forces and contribute to the update by the end of the year, but also to the next edition. Circular economy in particular is a topic that we've been working extensively on at the OECD, and I think continuing to push the knowledge frontier is much needed these days. The second point is that I find the formula you had today of training, specific officials and continuing also this process whereby the knowledge and the evidence is trickling down into the very wires of local and national government administration is actually the way to go, because we can continue to publish beautiful books, but if nobody owns them and uses them, they don't really guide decisions. So I think any knowledge development coupled with actual training makes a difference. And I think the last point for us is that recently we've shifted towards direct support to cities and regions in their recovery strategies. We've been working and setting up a few policy dialogues with the metropole of Aix-Marseille, for example, in France, or the province of South Holland in the Netherlands, the UK core cities, those satellite intermediary cities, as Mr. Sonobe would call them. And we've been really contributing to build consensus on the building blocks of their recovery strategies, but also the way to catalyze the needed finance and governance. And so I think if there's an extra mile to go and there's appetite there as well to join forces for more co-production of such dialogues in Asia Pacific and beyond, I mean, that's definitely an area where the OECD would be very keen to engage as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Aziza. Thank you, Dean Sonobe. We already ran out of time, so I think thank you very much. With this, I should conclude this session. I thanks all the panelists for investing your time with us today, and then please join me to give my appreciation to all panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas. The book is available as open access. So I put the link in here in chat in case that you don't receive the email about the link of the book. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now,
Goodbye.
yes, bye-bye. Now we continue to our webinar to session 3, climate change and sovereign risk. The moderator for this session will be Mr. Derek Hondo. He's the Capacity Building and Training Associate at ADBI. He holds MA in Global Environmental Studies from Sophia University, Japan, and Pre-Medicine BSc from Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. So without further ado, I give the floor to Derek for Derek the first.
Thank you very much, Nella, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So in today's session, session 3, we have 3 speakers. And first, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Byrne of the Asian Development Bank Institute. And he's been a research fellow here at ADBI since March 2019. His research interests are centered on international finance and macroeconomics. Before coming to ADBI, he worked at the European Central Bank for over 10 years, where his research focused on global financial markets, commodities, and financial stability, as well as global governance issues. So today, John will be presenting on climate change and sovereign risk in ASEAN. John, the next 10 minutes are yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Derek. So yeah, I would like to spend the next 10 minutes discussing this issue of climate change and its implications for sovereign risk, specifically in ASEAN and other economies that are highly exposed to the effects of climate change. So the structure of the presentation is as follows. Basically, there are 4 main parts. Firstly, to describe the risks posed by climate change in ASEAN, then to look at the transmission channels, so how this effect of climate change transmits to sovereign risk. Thirdly, some empirical evidence will be presented to show the quantified effect of climate change on sovereign borrowing costs. And finally, falling out of all of that analysis, I will describe some policy implications. So I only have around 10 minutes, so I'll have to be quite efficient with my time.
Right. Sorry, John, can I just interrupt?
Yes.
We aren't able to see your screen, so perhaps.
It says that it's sharing. Okay, I'll stop it.
That's okay. We can share it for you. Is that okay?
Okay, please go ahead. Yes.
It was sharing, but it was sharing the wrong screen. It was sharing your folder, not the PowerPoint.
Okay. Can you do it centrally, Derek? Sorry about that.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, so if you go to slide, which one? Slide, next one, next. Okay, so in this slide, we basically present evidence to show that climate change is becoming more of a problem, certainly over the past 2 decades. Everybody is aware of this, I'm sure, particularly in the case of ASEAN for floods and to a lesser extent storms and so on. And the issue, however, that I want to focus on is what this implies for strains upon the public finances and sovereign risk. So can you go to the next slide, please? Next, yeah. This chart is compiled from data from German Watch, who produce this data on a yearly basis. And it essentially ranks countries across the globe in terms of their exposure to climate risk. And what we can see is that Southeast Asian economies are highly exposed. So 4 of the top 10 countries exposed to climate risk are in Southeast Asia. So we have Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam on this measure, highly exposed over the past 20 years. Next slide, please. This slide demonstrates the percent loss in GDP per capita in Southeast Asian economies by 2030, 2050, and the year 2100 under 2 different scenarios, the RCP 2.6 and 8.5 scenarios. The 8.5 scenario is the so-called business as usual case, whereby climate change would continue to have its serious negative effects, whereas RCP 2.6 is a more optimistic scenario where adaptation and resilience measures, of course, would be introduced. And what we can see is that under the RCP 8.5, where So the business as usual case, we see much more dramatic and substantial percent losses in GDP per capita in Southeast Asian economies. So underlining the importance for these economies to address this issue. Next slide, please. So now, so far we've highlighted the extent of climate change risks in Southeast Asian economies and the macroeconomic impacts of that in terms of GDP losses. But of course, the focus of this presentation is to look at how this has implications for sovereign risk and strains upon the public finances. Next slide, please. So there are a number of ways that this can take place, not only through the direct fiscal impacts and knock-on effects to public finances in this regard, but also financial sector stability is an important factor which can have implications for the public finances via climate change. So, for example, physical climate risks can have, can magnify credit risks for banks. And this is related to issues in climate vulnerable countries whereby non-performing loan ratios will see increases due to extreme weather events. And this is, of course, only going to get worse unless appropriate measures are taken to address this. On the transition risk side, there are also significant risks for banks on the credit side. So, for example, in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, up to $60 billion of coal-fired power plants are at risk of stranding. So there would be a need to address that shortfall through the transition to a greener economy. And these risks, of course, can transmit from the financial to the sovereign via the intrinsic links between financial sector risk and sovereign risk. So this is one of the ways that climate change via financial sector stability impacts can have negative repercussions for sovereign risk. Okay, next slide, please. Another channel I would like to discuss is international trade. So this is a quite broad transmission channel through which climate change can affect sovereign risk, and there are a number of sub-channels through which this can occur, such as disruptions to supply chains. And this is particularly important in the Southeast Asian case, where there's a very high share of network trade and total manufacturing exports. And obviously a disruption of these would have implications for the public finance and the sovereign credit profile. Risks to agricultural exports are also going to have implications in this regard. Obviously, risks to tourism from climate change will have clear implications for revenue streams. And also on the transition risk side, I mentioned in the previous slide about significant transition risks, notably in Southeast Asian economies. And these would also put significant strains on the public finances. Next slide, please. So they're the conceptual transmission channels. For the next few minutes, I will discuss some empirical evidence based on analysis of 40 economies, some of which are more exposed to climate change than others, but I will focus the analysis on the highly exposed economies, which are those economies in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. So this slide just plots the basic relationship between the variables. So on the left-hand panel, we plot the sovereign bond yield on the vertical axis relative to climate change vulnerability. And what we can see there across a global sample of economies is a positive relationship. So rising exposure to climate change is associated with an increase in the cost of sovereign borrowing or worsening sovereign risk profiles. On the right-hand panel, we see the opposite effect. So we have a negative effect here, and this chart plots again the sovereign bond yield on the vertical axis, but on the horizontal axis we have resilience. So in other words, as resilience to climate change would improve, there's a dampening effect on the sovereign bond yield. So underscoring the importance to implement measures aimed at improving resilience to climate change in order to realize dampening effects on the cost of sovereign borrowing. That's what the basic data tells us. Go to the next slide, please. In this slide, we go a little bit more deeper and estimate in a regression framework and a vector order regression framework on the right-hand side, the effect of climate change, both vulnerability and resilience on sovereign bond yields for a range of different economies. Importantly, these estimates control for broader macroeconomic factors that would typically impact upon bond yields. So what we do as a result of that is really isolate the effect of climate change on sovereign bond yields because it controls for all of these other factors. And if you look at the blue bar on the left-hand panel, what we can see is that for those economies that are most highly exposed to climate change, they face the highest premium on their sovereign bond yields as a result of this. So for the high risk group, so this is the last blue bar there. So for this group of economies, the premium on sovereign bond yields is almost 300 basis points compared to around 150 basis points for the ASEAN group. If we just look at the ASEAN group, which is also a substantial strain on the public finances, and it's somewhat less for the other country groups. On climate risk resilience, which is in orange, we do find a significant and dampening effect, although the magnitude of the effect is much lower. That said, there are caveats around that, and I think one of the well-known policy issues at the moment is to get better data on resilience. And there's also a difficulty in truly disentangling vulnerability from resilience. So although we find that the effect is clearly negative, which is what we want to see, we don't find very large effects in terms of magnitude. On the right-hand panel, without going into too much technical detail, this is another type of analysis which demonstrates the effect of climate change on sovereign bond yields. And what we can see is that the effect of vulnerability leads to permanent effects on sovereign bond yields over time, and it's particularly strong in magnitude for high-risk economies, including those economies in Southeast Asia. That's the top panel on the right-hand side. On the bottom panel on the right-hand side, we find that also the effects on bond yields due to climate risk resilience is permanent over time. So in other words, to really to realize these dampening effects on bond yields, which are permanent, they don't disappear or subside over time, and they're statistically significant. It's really important for investments to be made in resilience and adaptation going forward. So next slide, please. So the implications of the results, there are two main takeaways from the empirical analysis. Firstly, it appears that vulnerability to climate risk matters substantially more for the cost of sovereign borrowing than resilience to climate risk. I showed that earlier with the difference in the magnitudes of the effects of climate vulnerability coefficients relative to climate resilience coefficients. As I said, there are a number of caveats around that, and it also can be the case, of course, that resilience is not appropriately priced by financial markets, whereas vulnerability has a dominant effect in terms of the pricing of sovereign risk by financial markets. So that's the first main takeaway. Second is that the magnitude of the effect on bond yields is notably higher for economies that are more exposed to climate risks. And of course, this is a problem for policymakers of these economies, because these are the economies that are most in need of adaptation and resilience investment, yet they're also the economies that are subject to the highest premium on their sovereign bond yields as a result of climate change. So they face serious financing constraints in order to address the issue as a result. Next slide, please. I think this is the final slide. Yes. So in conclusion, this short presentation has shown that firstly, ASEAN countries are highly vulnerable to climate change. There's some heterogeneity within that, of course. And there are significant threats to the sustainability of public finances, as it's shown through not only the conceptual transmission channels, but also the empirical analysis. Adaptation investments that help to mitigate climate risks would contribute to a lowering of the cost of sovereign debt. And this dampening effect on sovereign bond yields is shown to be permanent over time, really reinforcing the need for this policy action to take place. The policy implications that fall out of this analysis relate to three broad headings. First one would be to encourage the mainstreaming of climate risk analysis into public financial management. This has started to happen in recent years, but I think there's certainly a need for this to be rolled out more broadly, not only in Asia, but globally. Second one, it's important in a similar vein to adjust the monetary and prudential frameworks to account for climate risks. So this ensures that the macroprudential and financial stability risks are properly accounted for, deriving from the effects of climate change. And finally, the analysis underscores the importance for financial sector policies to scale up investment in climate adaptation and resilience, as well as ensuring solutions. And there are a number of ways that this can take place via local currency bond markets, for example, whereby sustainable infrastructure could be financed. And there are also solutions for insurance by the use of fintech, which is of course developing rapidly, certainly in the current era. So in that short presentation, I would conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I'll come back to you at the end of this session for some comments. So next, let's move on to the second presenter in this session, Dr. Nugroho Agung Wijoyo. He's a senior policy analyst from the Center for Financial Sector Policy in the Ministry of Finance in Indonesia. He's responsible for providing comprehensive analysis and recommendations for policymakers. And he specifically formulates, determines, and provides recommendations on financial policy sectors in accordance with the provisions of laws and regulations. So today he'll be presenting on the development of sustainable finance in Indonesia. So you have 10 minutes.
Oh.
Hello?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Derek, for introducing me to present the development of sustainable finance in Indonesia. The National Medium-Term Development Plan for period 2020 to 2025 plan accordingly is expected to become a reference at the community level for public participation and monitoring of national development to drive prosperity and welfare of the nation. Management model which account for resources, social capital, and government capacity is needed for a sustainable finance development. Hence, if socialization is done appropriately, the people can also be involved in such matter, like by actively participating with sustainable economy. The President Joko Widodo in Paris 2015 proclaimed the goal of reducing Indonesia greenhouse gas emission by 29% with national efforts and 41% with international financial assistance in relation to a business as usual. Next. Please, next. Next, please. This is only the agenda. Next. Why we work on sustainable finance? Because we see sustainable as a key lever to influence sustainable outcomes. The private sector will play an important role in redefining business as usual, helping to support the transition from exploiting nature to restoring nature. The financial sector is in a unique position to incentivize the transition through only agreeing to lend to, invest in, and insure businesses that manage their nature risk and impact. Financing sustainable business has strong financial as well as broader societal benefit, which is why sustainable finance continue to gain traction. Next, please. Sustainable development goals, such as climate change mitigation and adoption efforts, are reflected in the Sustainable Finance Initiative as a focus to support global in sustainable financing. For example, sustainable financial investment needs in emerging countries for period of 2016 to 2030 is 23 trillion US dollar. It seeks to mainstream sustainable development principle across all development sectors to maintain the sustainable community's social life, economic welfare, and environmental equality. Under the National Medium-Term Development Plan for the period of 2020 to 2030 demands that development activities must not degrade the carrying capacity of environment and balance of ecosystem. Next. The first pilot project of First Movers is to fund the environmental, social, and governance, and the green projects such as bank which green portfolio reached 809.5 trillion rupiah, or around 55.9 billion US dollar. Global sustainable bond 12.25 trillion rupiah, and green and gender bond 59.9 trillion rupiah. They also initiated the Indonesian Sustainable Finance Initiative to invite other financial institutions on join as the first mover. Next, please. This is overview for sustainable finance term. We have two OJK regulation number 51, 2017 on the implementation of sustainable finance, and the second is OJK regulation number 60, 2017 on issuance and requirement for green bonds. The program objectives is to support financial services institutions to improve their social and environment performance in Indonesia towards a sustainable approach that is in line with international standard and best practices. Financial services institutions will benefit as they will help them protect the bank's loan portfolio against business risks. It will also enable them to identify new business opportunities offered by the green economy. Next. We have roadmap phase 1 and phase 2. The roadmap for sustainable finance lays down a detailed work plan on the sustainable finance program for the financial service industry. It specifies the measure and recommendation that need to be adopted in the form of an integrated work plan involving all financial services institutions. The roadmap is intended to become an integrated part of OJK Master Plan for Indonesia financial services sector. Next. Next. Understanding fiscal, monetary, and financial sector policy mix to promote sustainable development, we need to know the Indonesian financial systems, namely financial regulatory authorities, public authorities, and industry bodies. Indonesian Financial Service Authority, or we call it OJK, is financial regulator with authority to regulate, supervise, examine, and investigate the financial services sector in Indonesia. Bank Indonesia, the Indonesian Central Bank, is responsible for monetary policy, macroprudential regulation, and the payment system and foreign exchange. And the Ministry of Finance, besides setting the managing central government budget, together with National Development Plan Agency, the Ministry of Finance is responsible for the formulation, stimulation, and implementation of financial policy. Next. As the world's fifth largest emitter of greenhouse gases and the largest contributor of forest-based emission, Indonesia's success in achieving its national climate pledge will be critical to keeping the planet's temperature rise well below the 2 degrees Celsius threshold called for in the Paris Agreement. Almost 1 year has passed since Indonesia submitted its first national climate action plan, or nationally determined contribution to United Nations. In it, the country pledged to reduce its greenhouse gas emission by 29% by 2030 against a business as usual baseline scenario, and up to 40% subject to international assistance and financial support. To achieve its target, Indonesia needs to give priority to full implementation of key existing land use and energy policy and start to implement more ambitious mitigation action. The prerequisites for accomplishing this strategy are transparency and good governance. Acknowledging that climate change is multidimensional, cross-sectoral issues will allow better vertical and horizontal collaboration not only between government agencies but also in coordinating with businesses and civil society. Finally, an approach prioritizes a commitment to an action institutionalized climate change measures at the national and local level and establishes concrete collaboration to scale such effort could lead a real progress and position Indonesia as a leader in both sustainable effort and economic development. And climate risk country profile Indonesia, projections of temperature rise for Indonesia are hindered by lack of fine resolution model. The most projections suggest that overall warming could be less than the global average. Warming in range of 0.8 degrees Celsius to 1.4 degrees Celsius is expected by the 2050s in Indonesia. Projections should be approached with caution as higher warming rates could be experienced inland. Indonesia is ranked in the top third of countries in terms of climate risk, with high exposure of all types of flooding and extreme heat. The intensity of this hazard is expected to grow as climate change. Without effective adoption, population exposure will also rise. For example, the population exposed to extreme river flood could grow by 1.4 million by 2035 to 2044. Climate change is also likely to have impacts on water availability, disaster risk management, urban development, particularly in coastal zones, and health and nutrition, with implication for poverty and inequality. While national level vulnerability index, such as ND gain country index, suggests a reduction in overall national level climate vulnerability in Indonesia, there is a high variation in potential impacts of climate change at the regional and local levels. Without well-planned adoption and disaster risk reduction effort at this level, the poorest and the most marginalized communities are likely to experience significantly loss and damage as a result of climate change impacts, especially in the pandemic COVID-19. That's all of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wijoyo. And we'll come back to you later with some questions. Okay, so next, let's move on to the third presenter for session 3. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Kung Kongtavisak. He is an economist at the Bureau of Saving and Investment Policy of the Fiscal Policy Office in Thailand. And his responsibilities include studying and analyzing policies related to capital markets and considering the application of licenses for capital markets, such as stock exchange broker licenses and digital asset brokers. He's also part of the Sustainable Finance Working Group, whose objective is to support and push forward the policies of sustainable finance in Thailand. So this is also his topic for today's presentation. So Mr. Kongtavisak, you have 10 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Direct. Okay, in this presentation, I will present about the sustainable finance in Thailand. Next slide, please. Okay, at the present, our country around the world are facing the problems of from the climate change. And according to the Global Climate Index 2021 report, that the Thailand was ranked 9th of the country where it affects mostly by extreme weather event. And you can see on this one, I will separate this into the two groups. The first one is extreme weather events, such as a heat wave, flood, tropical cyclone, drought, and the latest one is about the COVID-19, is create the short-term but large impacts. And for the another side is about the slow onset events. It's increased temperature, sea level rise, land and forest degradation, and desertification is create a long-term cumulative impacts. And all of that, it creates many loss and damage and irreversible change in Thailand. Next slide, please. Okay, and next I will give an example from the negative effect from the COVID-19 and I will give you an example in economics perspective. That you can see from the graph that it will reflect that the COVID-19 affect to lower real GDP, private consumption, exports, war higher and employment rate, public debt to GDP and NPL. And for the real GDP in 2018 is about the 4.2%, but after the COVID-19 in 2020 is made the real GDP decrease to minus 6.1%. And for the unemployment rate in 2018 is about around 1%, but after the COVID-19 we have increased to 2%. And for the public debt to GDP before the COVID-19 was about around 40%, but after the COVID-19 it have increased to 54.9%, while fiscal sustainability framework of Thailand is at 60%. And next, I will give the explanation why the public debt to GDP ratio in Thailand is increased. Next slide, please. Okay, the Thailand have increased the public debt because we have many recovery program in Thailand. As you can see, we have the 3 emergency decree loan for the first The first one is for helping the people and improving the economy is about 1 trillion baht. And the second one to issue the soft loan for business sector, especially in SME for 500 billion baht. And the last one will to maintain the financial stability for is allow 400 billion baht. And according to the COVID-19, Thailand has increased about the 1.5 trillion baht since 2019. And next slide, please. And okay, as the first, I will have to tell you that Thailand have already many plans for the sustainable development because Thailand have incorporated its commitment to the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And we also commit in the Paris Agreement that we will decrease the carbon dioxide to 20 to 25%. To achieve the above commitment, Thailand already have the primary as the following that will cover in many sectors in Thailand about the energy efficiency, alternative energy development, the power development, the smart grid development, the environmentally sustainable transport system, national industrial development, environmental quality management implemented under the Montreal Protocols and Ragnamar projects. Next slide, please. And now we will move to the financial sector. At the first one, I have to tell you that actually in Thailand, in each sector, they have their own to promote sustainable finance. For example, for banking sector, the Bank of Thailand have launched the responsible lending guideline, and some of private banks have already signed in the principle of responsible banking from UN. And for the capital market, the Security and Exchange Commission have launched the guideline to issue the green bond, sustainable bond, and social bond. And for now, Thailand have already the 3 kinds of this bond. And moreover, the Ministry of Finance also issued the sustainable bond to recovery have already issued the sustainable bonds because we want the budget to recovery from the COVID-19. And then, and now we know that we have make a decision to collaborate to each other. Then we just build the working group of sustainable finance, which consists of the Security and Exchange Commissions, the Bank of Thailand, Fiscal Policy Office, and the Office of Insurance Commission and the Stock Exchange of Thailand to collaborate to each other. And the first project of this working group, we will do a sustainable finance initiative for Thailand. This one, we get the help from the GBRW Consulting and IFC to make this report. And we will use this report to be as a guideline to sustainable finance. Next slide, please. Okay, now I will tell you briefly about the sustainable finance initiative for Thailand. As deferred after the analysis in the sustainable finance environment in Thailand, we found that we still have a weak environment for sustainable finance development. So we have to improve it. For the first one, to improve that, we have to create a stronger pipeline of ESG fundraiser to make it will make a real sector to align to its business strategy to contribute the SDG, and it will result in the developing in the financial product related ESG. And the next one is about the deep pool on ESG investor. It will create the data pool which can be the information for the investor to make analysis and making a decision. And next one is about strong awareness of ESG by different stakeholders. This one will make both public and private sector collaborate to improve the long-term sustainable development. The next one is about the robust mechanism for ESG verifications that will facilitate the standard to classify the economic activity. And the last one is highly regard and talent human capital to improve the human capital related to sustainable development. From these 5 points to improve the sustainable finance ecosystem, then we have 5 key strategic initiatives to develop it. And the first one, we will developing a practical taxonomy. And in this stage, we are still in earlier, but we will focus on the green taxonomy. And okay, and the next one will be an improving of the data environment. This will include about the disclosure related to climate change and sustainability. And the third one will be implementing the effective incentive. This will be included in both financial and non-financial, and also in incentive and disincentive to improve the sustainable development. And the next one is about the creating demand-led product and service. This will make them to aware and see the business opportunity in the sustainable finance market. And the last one is about the building human capital. This one will have a plan to improve the human capital and improve the skill related the physical economy related the sustainable finance. And next one, please. Okay, then to conclude that there are many risks from the climate change that we have to realize in the negative results. So the Thailand will follow the primary plan, and in the financial sector, we will follow the sustainable financial initiative recommendation to create sustainable development and improve the financial ecosystem. But however, the country cannot achieve its target by the government and regulator, so it still need the collaboration from our unit in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for keeping to the 10 minutes. Okay, so next I'd like to go back to John, if you have some comments on our 2 presenters.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the 2 presenters for presenting very interesting work. I have a number of comments that cut across both presentations, which I'll go through. I have 4 or 5 points to make. I think that, you know, while the presentations were very informative, they were still at a relatively high level, so quite broad, and it would be of interest to go a little bit deeper on the specifics. For example, on the NDC progress, where are the gaps? Are the targets, are the quantified targets at least realistic? Is there a need for a revision to any of those targets that are in place? So that would be a point on the NDC progress. Second point, which links a little bit to the presentation that I made. So the 2 countries in question, Indonesia and Thailand, they're in my study as well classed as being highly vulnerable to climate change, with substantial impacts on sovereign risk and public debt sustainability risk going forward. So I wonder, are there already any material implications of climate change for fiscal sustainability in your economies? That would be interesting to find out about. Another point which I didn't see in the presentations was about the financing of adaptation and resilience investment. So what is the situation as regards that? Are there constraints? Is there any movement on involvement by the private sector, which is of course very difficult? what about international support? Is that considered as one of the options in the economies? Another issue, of course, is in the transition to a greener economy. It's important to somehow encourage private investment in renewable energy. And one of the major drivers of that has been, in the past at least, government expenditure on R&D. And to the extent that climate change would detrimentally affect the finances, this will, of course, impede the extent of government expenditure on R&D that could take place, and by extension would impede the potential level of private investment in renewable energy. So the question is, has there been any success in transitioning to a more greener economy through investment in renewable energy? And the final point relates to international cooperation. So, of course, it's imperative that each of the economies pursue the NDC targets and try to address climate change in their own right. But of course, climate change is a global issue requiring international cooperation. So I'd be interested to see, from your perspective on the ground, if you like, what your experience has been of cooperation on addressing these NDCs, or are you basically left to your own devices to do that at the national level? So there would be my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for those comments and also those questions. I'll go ahead and let Dr. Wijoyo address these first.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. John. Related to NDC progress, funding needs to achieve NDC. Prior to NDC roadmap, estimated funding needs to achieve the NDC target referred to the 2018 second biennial update report. Funding need in a board updating reports reach 3,460 trillion rupiah, or around 2,066.2 trillion per year from 2018 to 2030. After the existence of the NDC roadmap, the funding requirement to achieve NDC is relatively higher, namely 3,779 trillion rupiah. On average, funding per year required at least 343.60 trillion rupiah. This is related, and then related the fiscal sustainability. We have a government budget as an instrument to promote green economy transformation. The state revenue policy is directed at stimulating the development of new and renewable energy and environmentally friendly business sector. The Ministry of Finance provides tax facility in form of tax holiday, tax allowance, exemption from import duty, reduction of value-added tax, income tax burdened by the government, and reduction of building land tax to support geothermal development and other new renewable energy. And the Ministry of Finance implement the climate budget tagging mechanism at the national and regional levels to determine the contribution of government budget to climate change management. The implementation of climate budget tagging in the regions in collaboration with the Ministry of Home Affairs and local governments. And then about the international cooperation. Yeah, you suggest that ASEAN countries are already having to pay a climate-related related risk premium on sovereign bond now. With a worsening of climate change and a greater awareness of investors to climate change impact, the risk premium is likely to increase in the future. So implication is that the country like Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, which are among those countries with greater need for adaptation and resilient investment will face greater constraint in facing those. So I think we need the kind of international cooperation like you suggestion in your paper. So among ASEAN countries, we have like a funding pool to help each other to pay climate related risk premium on sovereign bond. This is my comment. And actually right now, yes, we have increase in government budget related to climate change since pandemic COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wijoyo. In a couple minutes, I'd like Mr. Kongtavisak to kind of share his perspective from Thailand on investments, as John mentioned, investments in R&D and international cooperation and other barriers. Sorry, could you please unmute?
Okay, at the first, actually, that I have told you that we have many collaboration that we have to, and for the best example that I have know that will be related about the capital markets and the Security and Exchange Commission that they have launched the guideline to issue the green bond, social bond, and sustainable bond. This guideline we have used the ICMA, the ICMA standard and the ASEAN bond standard that will make it can rely in the international sustainable market. And for the moreover, we also have the investment code and the corporate governance code that we will set about the guideline from the UN to improve the to acknowledge the institutional investor to make a decision to about to invest in the sustainable development. And moreover and that's all for the collaboration for an international collaboration, and that's all for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Because of time, I'd like to thank all of you, Mr. Kongtavisak and Dr. Wijoyo and John, for your input on this session. And for the audience, if you have additional questions, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A box. And I would kindly ask the presenters in this session to please answer these after this. Thank you very much. Back to you, Nella.
Thank you, Derek, for the very good time management. Now we are going to our fourth session, that's last session in our webinar. So the moderator will be Mr. Alexander Bowden. He's a capacity building and training associate in ADBI. He holds master degree in public policy from Australian National University and the University of Tokyo. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Alex, please.
Thank you, Nella. So I will be moderating over the session 4 for financial authorities support in greening the financial system. And I'll be joined by 3 speakers today, the first of which is Dr. Ulrich Volz, who is the director of the Center for Sustainable Finance and a reader of economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies. University of London, and Senior Research Fellow at the German Development Institute. Without further ado, Dr. Volz, I would like to invite you to begin your presentation.
Hi, hello, good morning. Well, good afternoon, everyone. For me, it's still morning. Shall I share my slides, or will that be done centrally?
Feel free to go ahead and share your slides if you like.
Okay, good. Well, all right. Good. So let me just do it. Screen. All right. Good. So I take that colleagues had a chance to look at the online lecture, so I try not to repeat too much from that. But I'll try to make the case why central banks and financial supervisory authorities have a very important role in governing sustainable finance. You all know that we have a huge problem with climate change. So we have a looming climate crisis. Climate scientists tell us that we have around a decade left to fundamentally change our economies, to decarbonize our economies, to prevent catastrophic global warming. We are already, as for example, John discussed in the last session, seeing massive ramifications of climate change that is underway. So we've seen a huge increase in the intensity of climate-related disasters. We also see sea level rise and so on. So kind of slow onset events. And all these create very substantial risks for our economies. And that has also an implication for the financial sector. So we need to make sure to climate-proof our financial sectors. I mean, our economies more broadly, but also our financial sectors. And that is very much the role of central banks and supervisors. But it's not only the physical risk, we also have, of course, the transition risk. So if we're serious about mitigating global warming, we need to take very drastic steps to decarbonize our economies, and this will create large readjustments in our economies, our various sectors, including transport, energy, construction, but others as well, manufacturing, will have to rejig. And there will be winners and losers. And so there will be substantial transition risks in this low carbon transition. And this is a global process. So even for developing emerging economies where the carbon emissions are fairly low, they may still be affected because demand for, say, fossil fuel exports may diminish very rapidly and so on. And that can have very substantial effects on the balance of payments and others, but it will create disruption in the financial markets. And so financial authorities, central banks, supervisors need to make sure that each and every financial institution adapts to the changing circumstances and mitigates these risks. But even more, we need the financial sector to also be part of the solution. To be successful in the transition to a low carbon economy, we need to massively ramp up investment in renewable energy. We also need a massive investment in climate proofing our economies. And so we need to invest very large amounts. So we need to scale up sustainable finance. And arguably, there's also a very important role that financial supervisors and central banks have in redirecting capital away from dirty, harmful activities that have been contributing to the climate and other ecological problems to areas that help solve these problems. So finance is at the very heart of our economies, and the central banks and supervisors are at the heart of finance. And so they need to govern this transition to a sustainable financial system. And a lot has happened over recent years. I myself started working on sustainable finance and also the role of central banks and supervisors a good decade ago. And it was actually that I started with Bank Indonesia and OJK later to work on how Indonesia can scale up sustainable finance. And as we could see in the previous presentation, Indonesia and others have come a long way, and this is becoming much more prominent now. Back then, it was a very niche topic, and very few would realize its importance. But now we have a network of central banks and financial supervisors for greening the financial system, with now 92 members, including all major central banks and supervisors around the world. There is really a consensus building that they need to play an important role. But for long, the focus has been very much on analyzing risk and identifying risk. And that is super important. And we certainly need disclosures, and indeed mandatory disclosures, to help a better analysis of the risk. But we would be foolish to believe that just enhancing transparency would be enough. Central banks and supervisors need to do more. They need to adjust prudential requirements to explicitly take into account climate risk and other sustainability risk. They need to also make sure that all their operations, that includes monetary policy for central banks, are in line with sustainability goals, so that central banks themselves don't perpetuate activities that are high risk. So it's really crucial that central banks and supervisors send very clear signals to financial markets and demand from players that they analyze risk properly, and that they take explicit or adopt explicit strategies on how they prepare for a net zero transition. I'd like to emphasize that central banks and supervisors have a market shaping role. So financial markets, of course, develop by the actions of the participants, but central banks and supervisors do set the framework conditions. And so there are, for example, important things that central banks and supervisors can do, I mean, in partnership also with finance ministries and other players in that place, in creating market conditions, in creating new markets. We've seen that with the development of green bond markets, which was basically created by public development banks. But we need, for example, central banks in developing emerging economies to foster the development of local currency bond markets that are taking sustainability into consideration, but that has to go beyond green bonds. So there are different types of instruments that need to be developed, sustainability-linked bonds and so on. Central bank supervisors need to play an important role in developing fintech solutions. They hold great potential to help aligning financial systems with sustainability goals and so on. We really need to take a holistic approach, and it's very adequate that we've had colleagues, officials from different areas of the financial sector and the and government here. And when I emphasize that central bank supervisors need to play an important role, that of course does not mean that they should replace government action. we really need to have a strong interplay between government action on climate and the role of central banks and supervisors and of course markets. So this market shaping role is really important. And kind of my favorite phrase in this context is that central banks and supervisors can play an important role by complementing, catalyzing, and amplifying government policies. It's not about substituting them, but it should be also clear that central banks by themselves, supervisors by themselves, they cannot really address the problem sufficiently alone. But it's also clear, in my view, that without decisive action from these players, we won't be able to solve the problem either, because as I said at the beginning, the financial system is at the very heart of the economy. And if we don't align it, if we don't make finance part of the solution, rather than being part of the problem as it is now, because for the time being, financial sector still today continues to finance a lot of activities that very much run contrary to sustainable development goals, climate goals, and so on. And experience shows that without setting the right frameworks, the right governance frameworks through public policy, it is very unlikely that financial markets will just change by themselves. So this is actually the end of my presentation, and I very much look forward to further discussions later on, and of course to the presentations of the two colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Volz. That was very interesting, particularly your point about the importance of central banks as market shapers, signal senders, and policy amplifiers. So next up, we have a presentation by Mr. Shah Hussain. He's an economist from the State Bank of Pakistan. He graduated from the International Islamic University in 1998 and got his economics degree from the Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. And since then, he has worked at the Directorate of Education in 2002, and most recently has been working in the State Bank since 2008. Now, Mr. Hussain today will be discussing the effect of extreme weather and COVID-19 on industrial production, the role of the central bank in mitigating the impacts. Mr. Hussain, you have 7 minutes. Mr. Hussain, could you please unmute yourself?
Yeah. Are you hearing me now, please?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. So let me introduce the title of our presentation. The title of my presentation is The Effect of Extreme Weather and COVID-19 on the Industrial Production of Pakistan, the role of the central bank in mitigating the impacts. Next, please. The contents of the study are the following. First of all, I would like to have a brief introduction about the study. Then I have discussed the stylized facts, and I have reviewed all of the literature, but that is not the part of this presentation. Then we will discuss the data and methodology, and the last section of the study will be conclusion and recommendation, but that is also not included in this presentation as well. Next. Okay. So let me briefly introduce that why I would like to conduct this study and why I would like to have selected the topic. Or you can say what are the motivating factors behind this topic. So first of all, it is clear that Pakistan makes a small contribution to the greenhouse gases emission. However, Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable among countries to climatic changes because the surge in frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. For example, I would like to limit my discussion to the brief discussion to the last 2 decades. It was a heavy rainfall was recorded in 3 out of 4 provinces in 2007. Then you know that in 2010, massive floods occurred in the entire country. The country faced a massive flood in 2010, and again, not with the same intensity, but consecutive, there was floods in 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2014. And lastly, I would like to mention also that Karachi is one of the biggest city of the country, and it is a financial hub as well. And Karachi received the highest rainfall in a single day in 2020, and which was the highest in the last 90 years. Again, you see that erratic monsoon rain causing frequent floods and intense floods. And due to these floods, increased siltation in dams and reservoirs. And lastly, the speed of COVID-19 caused considerable damage to the economy as GDP contracted by 0.4% during fiscal year 20. Next, please. Okay, so as a part of the motivating factor, this is very crucial graph, and to make it simple and understandable, I made a 5 years average during the winter season and show the relationship between industrial production growth, rainfall, and mean temperature. So the graph clearly indicates that there is an inverse relationship between temperature and industrial production. And my motivation factor is, and you can say that this is why I would like to study it in detail and to estimate the impact of temperature and rainfall for the industrial production of Pakistan. So there is a clearly inverse relationship between these two variables. So next, please. Here's the previous graph. This is also the same graph, but it is for the summer season. And you can see it in the summer season, there is a heat, you can say a rise in temperature. And again, there is this inverse relationship to be noted between the temperature and industrial production growth in Pakistan. So these two graphs clearly indicates that as increase in temperature leads to decrease in the growth of industrial production in Pakistan. And this industrial production in Pakistan determine the exports, imports, and so many factors. So that is why I selected to have to investigate the topic in detail. Next, please. Aside from these main variables, that industrial production is the dependent variable, and rainfall and climatic change and pandemic, just like these variables are the main variable to be estimated the impacts. I would like also to discuss I would like to discuss the control variables in order to isolate the impact of temperature and rainfall for industrial production. So these control variables are private sector credit growth, depreciation, and weighted average lending rate. And again, it is shown in the graph that the expected impact of control variables are there over the industrial production. Weighted average lending rate and the depreciation have inverse impacts for the industrial production, and whereas private sector credit has expected positive impact on industrial production. So these three variables and maybe consumer price index will be used, will be incorporated in the model as a control variables. Next, please. Another important area of the study will be the SBP, or you can say State Bank of Pakistan, which is the Central Bank of Pakistan. This SBP measures during the pandemic, and the SBP measures during the floods, during the dengue virus. All these things will will be discussed in the detailed study. So I am here confined to the measures which are being taken during the COVID-19. So the first and significant measure that was taken by the Central Bank of Pakistan, that was the significant cumulative reduction in the policy rate. This next is the temporary economic refinance facility, subsidized loan to the private sector, loan extension and restructuring package, supporting the health sector, and SPP Rozgar, or you can say employment schemes. And these things are stipulated is the next slide. Next, please. So these are the, you can say in concrete, these are the concrete measures taken during the COVID-19 by the Central Bank of Pakistan. And the first and most one is the 625 basis points cumulative reduction in the policy rate during the pandemic. Then is the loan deferred, and that is equal to 659 billion rupees. And next is the loan restructured, and that is 253.6 billion rupees. Loan approved for the budget, 238 billion rupees in order to avoid unemployment in the country. And next is the loans approved for hospital, 13.4 billion rupees, and loan approved for investment. So the total amount becomes 1,598 billion rupees, and most of these loans are subsidized loans, and there was a positive response from the private sector to all of these measures. Next, please. Okay, so the study, the detailed study will be discussing the data and methodology, and as I mentioned already, that the dependent variable of the study will be industrial production index, and our main regressors to which we are interested to estimate the impacts of extreme weather, zinc and COVID-19, and SPP subsidized loans or SPP measures taken during these extreme weather, or you can say in zinc or COVID-19 period. Besides these main variables, I would like to include the private sector credit, interest rate, and exchange rate, and consumer price index as the control variables in order to isolate the impact of extreme weather, COVID-19, and SPP loans. Next, please. Next slide. So, the estimation methodology of the study is the first one is quintile regression. The main purpose of the quintile regression is in order to check the stability of the coefficient at various quintiles, because there is a huge changes in the data. So quintile regression means that there will be we will be able to check the stability whether the coefficient are changing with different quantiles or not. So this is the main, the first methodology to be used, or the first regression to be used at the study. The second main methodology is vector error correction modeling, and the purpose of this modeling is in order to estimate the short-run and long-run effects. And the last part of the study will be scenario analysis, and our scenario analysis will be depending on the RCPs developed by the World Bank. So RCP 2.2, RCP 4.5, and RCP 6.0. That will be used in order to have a scenario analysis at the end of the study. Next, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hussain. Now we will be moving on to Mr. Puasa Werkoro. He is the Chief Manager of Financial System Development at the Reserve Bank of Fiji. Mr. Puasa has over 14 years of central banking experience in areas of monetary policy formulation and implementation, banking and securities registry services, and financial systems development. Today, he'll be presenting on the role of central banks and financial supervisory authorities in governing sustainable finance in Fiji. Mr. Wadakoro, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, all. Warm greetings from Fiji. Before I begin, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the ADBI for this opportunity to share a few highlights from Fiji's sustainable finance journey. Jumping right in, our next slide provides an outline of my presentation. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'll provide some background on Fiji, highlight a few initiatives by our government and the Reserve Bank before zeroing in on our sustainable finance roadmap. Next slide, thanks. So Fiji is a small island developing state in the Pacific. We have under 1 million people across our 330 islands. Tourism is our main economic mainstay. We are considered the economic hub of the South Pacific, and we are highly susceptible to natural disasters. Next slide, please. Climate change is now the single greatest threat to economic development and the security of the Pacific Island people. In Fiji, we see this impact firsthand through considerable increases in the frequency and severity of weather-related events. These events greatly reduce food production. They contribute to an increase in the outbreak of vector-borne diseases and drive forced relocations of communities. And they also put additional pressure on the public sector's limited fiscal space to deal with these challenges. Next slide, please. Coping with natural disasters has become a way of life for us, and we, along with 4 other Pacific Island states, feature in the top 10 most climate vulnerable jurisdictions globally. Furthermore, our next slide shows that in terms of climate risk index, if we could move to the next slide, thank you. Climate risk index, which indicates the level of exposure and vulnerability to extreme weather events, Fiji also features in the top 10 globally. Moving on, in our next slide, we see the impact of tropical cyclones on our growth. These events can reset years of economic growth and progress with each occurrence. For example, Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016 cost us almost US $1.5 billion in damages, and this equates to around 29% of our GDP. These experiences make it clear that extreme weather and climate events pose a significant threat to our development potential. Next slide, please. The realization that climate-related risks are sadly not expected to abate in the immediate term have forced us to re-examine our national strategies and prioritize green development. Achieving sustainable growth, however, it's not easy. It's no walk in the park and requires a long-term commitment through investment and sustained financing. Also, given the strains on public finances, large-scale private investments are much needed for the transition towards a green economy. Next slide, please. The Fijian government has taken the lead in introducing a number of sustainable initiatives. Highlights over the decade include in 2016, we became the first country to ratify the historic Paris Agreement on climate change. 2017 was a milestone year for us. We assumed the UNCCC COP23 presidency and issued our first ever sovereign green bond globally. This marked us as the first emerging economy to do so. During the year, we also developed our 5- and 20-year development plans, which are aligned with global commitments, including the SDGs. And in 2019, most notably was the drafting of our climate change bill, which provides a legal regulatory framework to meet our Paris Agreement mitigation targets. Next slide, please. More recently, the government is working with the UK as well as the UN to develop a sustainable development bond framework. Our current target is to issue a blue bond early next year and using learnings from our green bond issuance to do so.
Lastly, we are quite excited about ongoing work on parametric insurance for farmers and microinsurance for those without traditional insurance. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, central banks can play a catalytic role in channeling funds towards inclusive and green objectives. At the Reserve Bank, we recognize that a key weapon in our arsenal is our strong convening power. And so we've taken the lead in undertaking work to promote greening the financial landscape. Our next slide covers a few initiative highlights by the central bank. Our ICEF, which aims to improve our balance of payments position, provides back-to-back concessional financing to businesses through regulated institutions in support of renewable and sustainable energy projects. Similarly, our disaster rehabilitation and containment facility assists businesses affected by weather-related events, and more recently, cover was extended to the impact of epidemics and pandemics. In December last year, we undertook our second National Financial Services Demand-Side Survey, and for the first time, we included a focus on assessing how women who manage the affairs of the household build resilience to climate-related disasters. Green and sustainable finance is also a focus of our upcoming 5-year strategy, which will guide our national financial inclusion efforts going forward. Also work with government on parametric insurance products, which will be channeled through the Reserve Bank's FinTech regulatory sandbox, which we introduced at the end of 2019. Next, we take a closer look at our sustainable finance roadmap. Our SFR journey has admittedly taken longer than anticipated for a number of reasons. In 2017, we commenced work on this after hosting a National Sustainable Finance Initiatives workshop. At the event, the financial sector agreed that yes, green and sustainable finance, they are important and indeed critical for Fiji, and they agreed that the Reserve Bank would take the lead in developing this enabling framework. Over the next years, we worked closely with the IFC and the Sustainable Banking Network to develop 3 drafts which were discussed at length internally. At 2020 end, the bank decided that sustainable financing was still a relatively new subject area for the financial sector, and that the Reserve Bank would need to firstly focus on building internal and industry capacity. It's a slower, more strategic approach, but at the end of the day, we recognize that this framework, for it to be effective and successful, we need to firstly be on the same page in our understanding of the subject matter, because at the end of the day, we are bankers first. The next step is to speak the same language, and this is only possible by developing sustainable finance taxonomies. Following this, we can then roll out the framework for industry consultations, and at this point, we're liaising with IFC and the ASPN to develop capacity building content for the training that will be rolled out in the next 6 months. Next slide, please. Challenges noted during this journey include having limited national expertise to lead and inform sustainable finance processes. We are acutely aware of the gap that exists in the market during this policy development phase. And really the way around this is constant communication with the industry and stakeholders on our plans and progress to keep them updated. In reassessing our MO, we've realized that this transformation, it's not something that can easily happen overnight, and that a more strategic step-by-step approach is needed. We anticipate that it will take up to 2 years to implement the framework, and we feel that ongoing collaboration and communication is key to maintaining this momentum. Next slide, please. My last slide is just on our way forward. We recognize that work to address climate change requires a concerted national effort and cannot be handled by any single institution. And lastly, there is no one-size-fits-all solution or approach when it comes to sustainable finance. It takes time to develop a framework of such magnitude, and it's important to develop a practical one that aligns with national development objectives and goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wetko. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Waltz to provide some, to discuss the 2 presentations. Dr. Waltz.
Yeah, thank you so much, both Shah and Puasa for very insightful presentations. I think so Shah, you started off with the observation that Pakistan contributes only 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions globally. But of course, Pakistan is very heavily affected by global climate change. And in the case of Fiji, it's of course even worse. Fiji is contributing almost nothing to global climate change, and yet it is one of the most heavily affected countries. And so this shows the injustice of this whole story. And I think it also highlights that we need more international support for developing emerging economies that are being published twice, really. One in the direct impacts of the physical impacts of climate change, but also the financial markets of developing emerging economies are increasingly being punished by financial markets because climate risk are much higher, and this is being priced in now. And we were able to show in a study for the UN that climate vulnerable countries pay a climate risk premium. So that is a big problem that is inhibiting these countries. And I think that's also a very strong justification why we need much more international support, climate finance. We need a much larger role of public development banks, multilateral development banks in addressing these issues. But let me just comment on a few things that Puasa highlighted. I think the course that the Reserve Bank of Fiji has taken is very impressive, and it really, in many ways, I think provides an example of what central banks should be doing. I mean, I'm not going to comment in detail, and you know, I'm sure there are a lot of, I mean, you're working on this, so this is not a final set of policy actions. This is being rolled out, developed, and certainly much more needs to be done. But I think, Puasa, you're highlighting the strong convening power of the RBF. You know, that is a very important point, and you really have can have a big impact on how financial markets adjust, and both in terms of better managing and mitigating the risks, but also, of course, in scaling up investment, not only in things like renewable energy, which is important, but you know, if you're frank, it doesn't really matter for global greenhouse gas emissions whether Fiji, you know, reduces its emissions from energy or not. But investment in resilience, for example, you know, that is really crucial. That is, in fact, a matter of survival. So helping the financial system to help the economy to better adjust to climate change, to adapt, to boost resilience, that is really a central role that the RBF can play. And I think it is playing. And I would actually like to highlight that we reviewed the responses that central banks and supervisors took in the course of the COVID crisis. And Shah was also emphasizing the various actions the State Bank of Pakistan took. Out of kind of a global sample of central banks, the Reserve Bank of Fiji was actually the only one that directly linked some of its crisis response measures to the COVID crisis to sustainability. So there was an import substitution and export finance facility which was directly linked to the goal of enhancing renewable energy business through concessional rates. And I think that's one tiny example, but it's a good example how you know instruments, and be they crisis emergency instruments or kind of standard instruments, can be calibrated towards addressing sustainability goals. because the challenge is so enormous. And of course, you have some people who will be, very prudent about, well, central bank has just a role to play in keeping inflation low, and that's it. But I think that is a very narrow perspective on central banking, and in practice, the central banks in most developing emerging economies have been much more pragmatic. And I mean, the State Bank of Pakistan also, and many other central banks across the Asia Pacific regions have been have been very actively engaged in different types of industrial policies, even though they may not want to call it that way. But this can actually also be important. And as I said in my kind of online lecture and also in my presentation before, I think there is really this important role in catalyzing and amplifying government policy. So we need this interplay of these different actors, be they central banks, supervisors, also kind of public development banks, and of course the whole of government. And I think kind of that came out very nicely from Pwasa's presentation. Shah, you were not able to present the results yet, but I'm very keen on getting those, and happy to kind of comment on your findings when you can make these available. I suppose I should probably stop here. I could go on, but I shouldn't. So back to you, Alexander.
Thank you, Dr. Volz. I now like to invite both of the discussants to respond to Dr. Volz. Perhaps if we start with Mr. Wedakotto.
Thank you very much for those comments. And while yes, we've made some considerable progresses, as a central bank in Fiji, we still feel that we have a long way to go. And one of the reasons why we are undertaking a lot of these initiatives, it boils down to our the resources that we really have given to work with. We have smaller numbers than most, and even our departments within the bank, their tasks, responsibility-wise, it's a lot wider. So we have taking a pragmatic approach in achieving this or contributing towards combating the effects of climate change and things like development. It's something that we don't really have a choice. And but I think a great, we've realized that whatever new policies we put out, we really have to take a strategic approach in getting all of the players on board. We have to get the buy-in, and especially from government. And as you said, the central bank, we can play a key role in amplifying the work that the government is doing. So right now, for something like sustainable finance, we understand that it's still a relatively new area for the country, for finance industry. So we're just trying to focus a bit more on capacity building, so we are all a bit on the same page before we can roll out this policy that we've been working so hard on over the last few years. Thank you.
So thank you for your interesting comments. I like the most of the comments. As far as I couldn't share the results. There are mainly 2-3 reasons. It was the first, you can say, the first topic I was introduced with the topic like just this one. Because most of the research I have done that is related to exchange rate and just like that. So most of the time I spend here, and that is spending at the literature review, and then collecting data was a very difficult task for me. So and most of the time I collected the data, and now my estimations are in progress, and I was confined to 7 minutes presentation. So therefore, I like to just have introduced the stylized facts and just a graphical presentation, because that was confined to only 7 presentation. And I will be very interesting to share my results if when it finalized with you, inshallah. And these results, I would again like your specific comments for the these thematic results, and I will share with you as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hussain. Now, I would like to receive some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box or raise your hand and we'll allow you to speak. Perhaps for the time being, we could, we have a question from the chat. Perhaps we could talk about, so the progress in Fiji and incorporating green growth into COVID-19 recovery plans. Is interministerial coordination a challenge when it comes to sustainable finance? Perhaps Mr. Redekoro or could take this.
Thank you very much for that question. So the way I guess this is handled in Fiji is our Ministry of Economy, which is similar to the Ministry of Commerce or Finance in most other countries. They have a climate change division, and this sort of migrated from our previous Ministry of Strategic Planning, and they are the ones who coordinate all of the government's efforts around sustainable finance and climate change mitigation. So they are, in a way, government's key point of contact for that, and we work very closely with them. They're the ones who have come up with a draft of our climate change bill. And of course, there are challenges because, budget is limited. Everyone may have other priorities that, competing priorities is always something to deal with. But I think they've just having that centrally under a key ministry has helped in the collaboration efforts. And, we do our bit as well. As I mentioned, our strong convening power in getting the financial industry on board and working with our many stakeholders as part of our wider development and financial inclusion role. So it's, as I said, it's no like one-man job. It requires a concerted effort, and we work very closely with government in order to achieve work towards achieving our climate change impact targets. Thank you.
Mr. Hussain, perhaps you could comment on the same issue about interministerial coordination in Pakistan when it comes to sustainable finance. I think that was a common theme of Mr. Redekoro's presentation, was the need for greater engagement between multiple stakeholders. And I was wondering, how is the situation in Pakistan in this regard?
This is a very good question. There is a close coordination, and there is a fiscal and monetary coordination board, and there is a close coordination between these two areas, the federal government and as well as the central bank. And most of these issues are being discussed in the fiscal monetary coordination board. And related to the sustainable development, there is a huge financing, you can say, spent during the last 5 years. For example, there is a 10 billion trees project in the launched by the central government of Pakistan and the federal government of Pakistan, and the central government is fully supporting this project. And before this 10 billion trees project, there was a 1 billion trees launch in the KPK, that is the province, one of the province, and that was completed, and that is visible on the ground, and that was also supported by the central bank. So you can say that there is a close coordination between the central bank and the federal government about the sustainable development in Pakistan.
If I may just chip in here, I think this coordination is absolutely vital. And again, you know, kind of, so for example, in Europe, you know, kind of traditionally, there is, you know, a lot of people saying, well, we you know, central banks need to be independent, and there needs to be kind of very, you know, shouldn't be any fiscal monetary cooperation and so on. And, you know, we really need to keep the distance between central banks and finance ministries. But I think we do need to have really this coordination, because it's such a complex problem. And I think one aspect is really important, and that is central banks and supervisors. They are really the ones that have the overview of what's happening in the financial sector in a way that no one else does. And they also have the analytical capacities. I mean, of course, everyone's under resource constraints, but in principle, you know, they have the best economists in the public sector to analyze where the macro financial risks lie. And so central banks and supervisors, they don't need to do everything themselves, but their analysis can be really critical for government to take the right decisions. And so we last year published a report on climate change and sovereign risk, where we suggested that central bank supervisors really need to play a critical role in analyzing risks, and that there should be some kind of national climate risk board where central bank supervisors, but also different branches of government, finance ministries, economics, planning, and so on, agriculture, which in many countries is really critical in the climate space, get together, and where central bank supervisors can really bring this knowledge to the table, and that is then kind of being taken up by different branches of government.
Thank you very much. Now, before we wrap up, we have one final question from the audience. And this sort of touches upon the last point that was raised in interministerial cooperation and bringing stakeholders to the table. This question is for Mr. Hussain. So the State Bank of Pakistan seems to be committed to sustainable funding, and the interrelation of industrial productivity with climate impact is very praiseworthy. Can this be extended to agricultural production as well?
That is also extended to agriculture as well, because there are, you can say, specifically subsidized loans given by the central bank to the agriculture sector, and that is not now. That is, you can say, that was given earlier as well. And from the last 5 years, the Central Bank of Pakistan really focusing on subsidized loans given to the agriculture sector, as well as to the SMEs, small entrepreneurs. So that is already being implementing by this central bank as well. So there are, you can say that there are specialized loans or subsidized loans given to the industrial sector, but before that, the agriculture sector is also being provided with these subsidized loans.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for your presentations today. I'd now like to invite Didi Beck I'll invite Nella Hendrietti to talk.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone. Now we are at the end of last session. Mbak Widya, please put the QR code. So we have reached the final stage of our today's webinar. So before I give over the stage to Didi Baik for closing, I would like to make an announcement for that. I believe that you already received an email for the link of the survey. So please fill it out. You can fill out from the email, or you can do the do the survey from this QR code. For that, we need this survey, to improve our the quality of our event, to provide you with the knowledge for development. So with that, I will give the floor to Deputy Dean Sengju Baik for his closing remark. Didi Baik, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Nella. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Trust you all keeping well. This two-day webinar and the 4-week online course have gone very quickly. From the country presentations in these 2 days, I surely observed that each of you have accomplished very much in this course. I congratulate all participants, certain government officials from Fiji, Kazakhstan, Indonesia, Mongolia, Philippines, Thailand, Pakistan, and Papua New Guinea. This e-learning program, which launched last year, aims to enhance the development impacts of ADBI programs through innovative and interactive teaching methods. Additionally, it provides the opportunity for policymakers to present their country cases based on one of the topics covered in the course, and to examine how such lessons can be incorporated into policies. I hope all of you participants have good memories and learning from this virtual program, and will be able to use the knowledge gained in your respective works. I take this opportunity to once again convey my sincere gratitude to Professor Paul Atkins from University College London, Dr. Ulrich Bolch from SOAS University of London, and my ADBI colleague, Dr. Dina Jegalieva and Dr. John Boney. Also, I would like to express my appreciation to all experts and authors in book launch session. Teddy Sonobe, Dean of ADBI, Nicholas Butchert from Global Solution Initiative, Holger Kuhne from GIZ, and Aziza Akmok from OECD. Indeed, I appreciate the various efforts taken CBT team members to put together this 10-week-long online course and deliver it smoothly. Sorry. We look forward to delivering ADBI Policy Maker E-Training program next year with different thematic area through online format via ADBI e-learning platform and on-site at ADBI in Tokyo. From now, you become alumni of the program, and we will be delighted to keep in touch with you. Thank you. Thank you very much all.